Donc, notre première présentation nous vient de Liz Evans, qui vient de l'Université de Nottingham. So, Liz Evans is going to do the first presentation. She's from the University of Nottingham. So, up to you.
Merci. Bonjour. Je suis désolée, je ne parle pas français, apart from what I just said. So I will be speaking in English, and thank you to Melanie for checking my pidgin French that I was saying it correctly. Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you, Marta, for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about a project that I'm currently in the middle of writing into a monograph. So it's a lot of messy thoughts in my head. Some are slightly more formed than others, so I'd appreciate any kind of comments and feedback on it. And in particular, there are two, I guess, key phrases in the title of my paper that I want to sort of clarify a little bit before I go on. The first is my use of the term transmedia culture, and I'm using culture quite specifically within this particular context. To essentially talk about a kind of permeating philosophy within UK television in particular, where notions of being transmedia are becoming quite fundamental ways in which broadcasters and content is operating. So the idea of transmedia storytelling, so creating a story that is spread across, a coherent story that is spread across multiple different media outlets, forms part of that. But it's positioning that within a collection of other strategic priorities that's happening within UK TV around issues of distribution, marketing, franchising, that sort of mean that notions of transmediality kind of permeate television culture and screen culture in relatively mundane, sort of everyday ways. So that's the sort of approach I'm taking it. This is something that Henry Jenkins has talked about very recently in a blog he wrote at the end of last year, where he talks about the idea of transmedia logics, that transmedia has to be thought of as an adjective that needs a noun being attached to it. And so I'm taking probably the biggest noun there is in talking about transmedia as a cultural structuring principle. So that's the sort of wider context of the project that I'm talking about. Is within the kind of space where increasingly screen content is inherently transmedia. Alongside that is this term engagement, and that's a little bit more complicated and is essentially what my project is about. So the project I'm working on is thinking about and interrogating what people actually mean by this term engagement and how people use it. There has been some scholarly attention around engagement, particularly in the last 5 years or so. One of the most noticeable being Philip Napoli's work, who talks about a shift from the exposure model of television, where it's just about eyeballs on the screen, to an engagement model where it's about something more than that, that it's not just about watching content, that engagement is about capturing something beyond the act of watching. However, the term remains relatively loosely defined. Napoli himself does come up with a definition, but one that's very tied to US commercial television. And as a British scholar, I always get slightly antsy about putting everything within commercial television terms. So I'm interested in exploring ways in which engagement gets defined, managed, and valued across different industrial contexts, to try and come up with a slightly closer, more tight-knit way of using the term, rather than just throwing it in quite easily to describe a whole manner of audience behaviours and responses, something which I myself have done and now can never do again, and it's very frustrating that I can't just use the word engaging. So what I'm doing within this particular project is looking at how engagement functions as a discourse. So how it's a word that gets attached to and assigns meanings, power, values to a set of relationships between producer, content, and audience within this wider transmedia context. So I'm interested in how different meanings become attached to the term, how those meanings then manifest within different production or consumption practices, and then how they ultimately filter through into different sets of cultural values. These contrasting values, particularly between practitioners and audiences, then ultimately lead to a negotiation over what engagement actually means and how it can be used to represent the kinds of relationships that we have with screen content. So in order to explore this, I've been doing a set of interviews and focus groups. I've spoken to about 39 transmedia practitioners, mainly in the UK and the US, but also in Canada and Denmark. They're predominantly independent transmedia consultants, so they run their own companies. They are then brought on by broadcasters, by film studios to make their stuff transmedia. Some do work directly for broadcasters, but the majority sit in a kind of independent consultancy space instead. Alongside that, I've done a series of focus groups within the US and the UK and a couple of questionnaires to get the sense of how audiences understand being engaged with content, alongside how practitioners understand engaging audiences. And one of the things that emerged quite strongly through these focus groups and interviews was that there were tensions between how practitioners defined engagement and how audiences defined the same thing. And this demonstrated the need to actually think through what we mean when we use the term engagement and how it might be sort of refined to be a little bit more specific. Most noticeably, this coalesced around ideas of medium specificity, which as a transmedia scholar was fantastic, because that's one of the things that sits at the heart of the kind of content that I like to look at. So whereas practitioners predominantly saw engagement as tied to a specific medium, as shifting as the audience is taken across and moved between different media platforms, audiences took a very different approach to it. They predominantly saw it as a set of common feelings, actions, behaviours, responses that didn't really matter what media they were talking about. They would slip very easily between talking about a book and talking about television and talking about a video game. That there was a sense that there was something common about this term engagement that wasn't tied to specific media. So through that, I've then come up with a model, or my model, of how we can understand engagement in a way that takes account for, yes, there being perhaps unique elements to individual media, but that also tries to find the commonalities between different media forms as well. And so ultimately, I've broken engagement down into three core components. First of all, there's a type of behaviour. We're doing something when we're engaged with a piece of content. Secondly, there's a form of response that might take multiple different forms. It might be an emotional response, it might be a physical response, it might be an intellectual response. And then there's always an element of value exchange. We always sacrifice something to have an engaging experience. And what that value is determines whether it was a good engaging experience or not. And so I'm interested in how those values also play out within the kind of moral economies of our daily lives and the households, but also within the industrial economies of the UK and US screen industries. Today, though, I'm going to focus mainly on the type of engagement and think a little bit more about how practitioners and audiences talked about behaviour and what people are actually doing when they consider them to be engaged. As I said, I'm still figuring out what my main argument is in relation to this. So this is very much a kind of work in progress collection of thoughts. So in the discussions with practitioners and audiences, three broad characteristics emerged that sort of defined different types of engagement. I'm using all of these terms very, very simplistically. They're all quite contested, they're all quite complicated, and in the book I will go into that in a bit more detail. So I'm kind of paring them down for the purposes of explaining the model. But I kind of position some behaviours within a kind of immersive framework. By this I do deliberately mean non-interactive forms of behaviour where we are sitting and watching something, we are sitting and reading something, we're not necessarily having a dialogue with that content. In contrast to then more interactive forms where I'm following mainly James Newman's definition of interactivity as mechanical input, so that there are those engagement behaviours where we have to press a button, we have to do something to make the content happen. And then the last category is a really awkward term that I haven't thought of anything better yet, and I'm borrowing the para prefix to talk about para-active activities, so behaviours. So by this I mean that's all those behaviours that we do around content. I don't just mean participatory culture. Often these kinds of behaviours get attached to things that would be defined as online participatory culture, but part of what I want to do is to open it beyond that specific context. So it might be talking with the people sitting next to you on the sofa. That's not quite participatory culture, but it is an activity that sits around content, and it is still a type of engagement. So where have I got to? So we can then start mapping how individual behaviours fit onto this Venn diagram, and it's deliberately a Venn diagram to clarify that obviously these overlap. One particular type of behaviour is going to have a different combination of these three characteristics. So watching a film is relatively immersive. Sitting in a cinema, for instance, is a very immersive kind of behaviour. It's not that interactive, and if we're following etiquette rules, it's probably not that para-active either. Something like a video game might cross over a little bit more. It's obviously a mix of both immersive and interactive. Tweeting, for instance, is interactive and more para-active because it sits around the actual content. It's only 3 examples. I've deliberately kept them quite simple, but to kind of illustrate where the model is sort of designed to go, that you would be able to fill that Venn diagram with many more different types of engagement behaviour. So I was then interested in finding out how audiences and practitioners valued different parts of this Venn diagram. So did they particularly associate engagement with one part of it or any other? And there were key differences that did emerge between those two groups. So practitioners predominantly highlighted behaviours that fell into the interactive or para-active part of the Venn diagram, especially those that did generate an element of social behaviour around the content. So a common metaphor for engagement within the practitioner interviews was a conversation or relationship. They were the metaphors that practitioners used over and over again to describe what they thought engagement actually meant. So this emphasis on conversational behaviours that sit around the content is also evident in a lot of the ways that the industry value engagement in this post-exposure model. Tweeting, Facebook liking, commenting on message sites, talking to each other, generating buzz, is how the industry publicly kind of values audience behaviour, and it very much and practitioners very much echoed that kind of valuing of engagement as something that sits around content and involves a form of conversation. So this is a quote from an independent US practitioner called Jay Bushman, who highlighted that, but also highlighted its sort of particular connection with transmedia, a kind of transmedia culture. So he talked about engagement with transmedia content happening between the pieces of content. That real, true engagement, he said, is the thing that gets people writing fanfic, fan art, starting organisations. He went on to say that's why transmedia is interesting. It's not just static images and static image, it's tweets, it's blog posts to video, but it's the spaces in between the individual pieces that the audience puts themselves in. Their consumption of it creates a bridge between those things, creates the meaning, the action, and the understanding, and their co-creating of it. That he very much valued those in-between spaces. Not the content itself, it's the stuff that happens around it. This wasn't just confined to online behaviours. So another conversation that echoed a lot of what Bushman was talking about was with a UK strategic planner, so someone who was involved heavily with the BBC's online strategy. She wanted to remain anonymous, I think, because she talked about the BBC's online strategy. But she described a very non-digital version of basically what Bushman was talking about. So she described a family who was part of her research, who had like a routine around a repeat of Top Gear on a digital channel in the UK. So she described how they need to engagement is the audience need to have felt that they have had quality time with others, and that might be literally people in the room, it might be tweeting, or feeling like you're a part of something that's bigger. There's a family involved in research for whom Top Gear repeats on Dave on a Friday night were their event TV. They'd pick up fish and chips, classically British, on the way home, and Dad would be back from work, and it was this ritualistic moment. So that was incredibly engaging as a piece of content. So again, the emphasis isn't on the fact that it's Top Gear, though Top Gear is part of that ritual, it's about the social aspects, the conversations that happen around it. This association continued when I asked her about measuring engagement, and she brought up things like Twitter tweets, Twitter mentions or hashtags as a sign of engagement having happened. What was particularly interesting was that a lot of practitioners were very anti the idea of engagement. They were actually quite critical of it. But even when they were doing that, they still held these associations very, very close and very, very clearly. So another anonymous web series producer in the US straight away said, I hate the term engagement. Engagement's terrible. And he meant it through social media engagement. He effectively meant people tweeting. So he would say, my goal is not to engage the audience, my goal is to marry them. So the relationship metaphor again. And he said, I prefer 1 million people watching my show than 5 million people tweeting about it. We keep selling engagement as the future, but engagement is just free marketing. So even when he rejected it, engagement was still about the stuff around the show, that was what the term meant. In contrast, audiences focused primarily on immersive behaviours. They were far more concerned with the actual relationship they had with the content, the experience they had with the content, rather than the experience that they had around it. So if conversation was the kind of key term that got associated with it for practitioners, for audiences it was captivation. They wanted to be captivated by content and therefore seek out as much of it as they possibly could. And again, this spread both across interactive and non-interactive forms of content. And at this point, it gets very close to some of the discussions earlier this morning, which was a really nice kind of intro, because the notion of binge watching came in a lot in this conversation, or binge playing when it came to video games. So this particular participant says, the barometer of my level of engagement is, will I sit and watch 3 episodes in a row, or will I watch 1 episode and think, okay, that was good, but let's give it 24 hours until the next one. So I suppose that sense of I can't wait, I'm going to watch 3 episodes in a row, spend the whole of Saturday afternoon in a darkened room, defined her idea of engagement. I don't have that quote, so I will move on. Sometimes this manifested in specific habits or markers of when they realised that they had been engaged. And a big one was what I'm sort of colloquially calling time suck. They did sort of use that in focus groups, and it's not quite as gross as it sounds. That basically when they suddenly forget that time has passed. So one said, I tend to get lost in things, so I'll forget about time, or something will be put in front of me and I'll be told, you haven't drunk anything for 2 hours, what are you doing? That came up. Then another Yennefer said, I watched the whole of Daredevil in a day. I accidentally watched the whole season, which I thought was quite a nice way of putting it. So this experience of time suck was framed as something as accidental, but also quite self-aware. Audiences were very aware that they did this. Even though in the moment they might not realise it was happening right then, they knew that this was part of their behaviour and part of their experience. And they got quite self-critical about it. So one said, oh, does it slip into addiction? Another one sort of quite self-deferentially said, I have no discipline when describing watching lots of content at the same time. Some even quite openly talked about how engagement for them was a sign when content had kind of taken over the rest of their life. So this was a comment from a student who talked about having a mobile application game. It was a battle game. I really engage with it, and it comes to times that I don't even pay attention to other very important stuff because I'm doing a battle on my phone, so I'll lose my bus stop. It's very important for me to win the battle rather than to not get down at the next stop and walk an extra 5 minutes. So there was a kind of awareness that sometimes it would take over their daily lives and they would sort of lose control over it a little bit. However, at the same time, these same people also took the opposite perspective and would deliberately plan in days where they consciously constructed an experience where they could be engaged. So this is Yennefer, the girl who accidentally watched Daredevil in one go. And she wasn't the only one. Talked about deliberately setting up her daily life in order to facilitate engagement. So she would say, there are days where I wake up in the morning and I know I'm going to spend the entire day just like no question about it. It's normally the day before. Tomorrow I will do nothing but play Uncharted. And that was quite common that people would not be very self-aware that this is what engagement meant to them, and they would seek out ways to make sure that it could happen. So there's therefore some tensions between how those who construct engaging experiences and those who experience them understand and value those experiences within the framework of engagement. So successful engagement therefore requires a negotiation between these expectations, those that producers place on their audiences and those that audiences have of the relationship with content they'll have. It might be tempting then to assume that the overlap between immersive and para-active behaviours is the kind of beautiful bit, that's where engagement is really going to happen, the bit where you can combine immersive and para-active behaviours. The discussions, however, didn't make it that straightforward, and in fact it was kind of challenged that these two things actually might not be as overlapping and as usefully combined as we might otherwise think. So this comment from Olivia, for instance, signified that for her, the producer's idea of engagement was actually a sign that she was disengaged, that she wasn't actually engaging with content. When talking about using her smartphone to look up something about a particular piece of content, she would say I wanted to look up the film for whatever reason, I'd do it afterwards. It was something if it was something captivating, I wouldn't want to miss it. But if it isn't, I quite like the idea of multitasking. So to her, those para-active behaviours during the content was a sign that she wasn't actually engaged with it. So there's a kind of temporal quality, a hierarchy that's going on here as well. That those para-active behaviours are an extension of engagement for audiences rather than engagement itself. So ultimately, thinking about engagement within transmedia culture by these kinds of specific characteristics, mapping what individual behaviours or instances, how they fit onto this Venn diagram, by thinking about the types of behaviour that the term defines and privileges in certain contexts, demonstrates how the relationships formed between audiences and content may be contested within different stakeholders in that content, and how the language used to define those relationships needs continuous and careful interrogation. So thank you. My other little bit of French. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Now we can have questions and discussion on the paper. So.
Speaking of the audience members you interviewed, how many of them mentioned
the use of tweeting?
To be honest, I had to push them on it quite a lot. They didn't bring it up as part of the conversation. I was trying to be deliberately not leading in the questions that I was asking, because I wanted their definitions of engagement to come out without me imposing my own. But normally there would become a point where I'd have to say, so is it tweeting? Is it like Facebook liking? That wasn't where they first went. So even though a lot of them were on social media generally, it wasn't something that they naturally brought to the conversation. So I did kind of have to push it. And that was then where the kind of, I'm not sure conversations came out of it. So it was, it took a little bit of work to get them to talk about it. They weren't doing it themselves.
Thank you, Liz. This is really interesting. I've got a question. You haven't mentioned, and probably because you've only had 20 minutes, but you haven't mentioned genre. So in your conversation, did it come up that, people treat reality TV or talent shows completely different from watching a drama, for example?
Yeah, it did. And again, kind of when I said to them, so I would ask the question very simply, what do you think being engaged means? It was always drama or fiction. That was the only drama in the loosest sense. They very rarely talked about other genres, which in itself I thought was kind of interesting, that there was this default association not only with the behaviours of those that are more immersive, but it's also the content that encourages that kind of behaviour more than, say, the more distracted behaviour. And a separate piece of research where I observed people I used cameras in people's houses, and that makes me sound like a little bit creepy, but it wasn't, I promise. Saw similar behaviour, that the multitasking was associated with reality shows, whereas concerted attention and the kind of immersive engagement was associated with dramas.
So what other words but multitasking did they use when they talk about talent shows, when they talk about British Bake Off and later on going to look for a recipe and things like this? I mean, there must have been, various words that they've used to describe this. I'm really surprised they're not using the word engagement for that.
Off the top of my head, I can't remember. All the transcripts are still floating around in my head. They would often be more specific. So they would talk about, they would talk about, before Bake Off, we went and found a recipe online. So they would label it, the behaviour very specifically. And that's one thing that I didn't have time to talk about, but that was common with practitioners. There were a number of practitioners that found it more useful to talk about specific behaviour rather than engagement because it was too big, it was too messy. And a lot talked about how when they get a brief that says we want to engage audiences, which they get quite a lot, their first question was actually what behaviours do you want to get out of it? So that process of actually being far more specific about how you talk about behaviour rather than labelling it all as engagement was actually something that was shared across both groups.
Sorry, I'm finished now. But isn't the word immersion then actually better than engagement? If, all people talk about is really being immersed into drama.
Yeah, in a way. And captivation actually, for the words that they used, it was captivation came out more. Because immersion, I think, is quite an academic term. So I'm putting it on their conversations because it's the way that we as scholars have understood that type of behaviour. But yeah, captivation and wanting more of it. That was how they talked about it in more kind of colloquial terms. Because captivation, I think, did come from a quote from one of my participants. Yeah.
I exploit this. Thank you very much, Liz. It was really, really interesting. Also, the typology and the way you make a lot of different stuff fit inside a single scheme. I add another one, and I ask you if you have thought about that in professional industry discourse. When you get to the ratings. I do not know if they are the exact terms in English too, but often when you go over the simple share rating and the usual variables, you usually consider also the permanence, I think it's called. It's permanenza in Italian, but it doesn't help. And the coverage, the copertura. These are two different metrics. One, the coverage, the number of persons who have seen at least a minute of a show. The permanence, of course, the average time a single person stays in front of the TV set for that show.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it resonated me with the two different aspects, engagement according to practitioners and engagement according to the audience. In some ways, the practitioners look for coverage, so a more dispersed maybe way of engagement, while the users, the viewers, want permanence, want to be connected and be immersed. I do not know if I'm speaking.
Sort of. I mean, there's going to be a whole chapter that's around the sort of temporality of engagement, and particularly that engagement isn't confined to the content. And the Poweractive approach is precisely about that it continues once you've finished watching it. And I'm really interested in when we actually start engaging and end engaging with something, because I don't think it is actually tied with content. And that's a whole other chapter that I've not started planning yet. But yes, sort of. I mean, generally metrics were met with a lot of skepticism, and one of them referred to them as the emperors not having any clothes, that sort of idea. So any kind of metric was kind of dismissed by a lot of the practitioners. Some did say that engagement is when they stay with you until the end. So when that was actually the kind of, have they stuck with the content? They did talk about duration of viewing and but they sort of didn't quite know what to do with it. They still sort of wanted to. There was a sense they generally wanted to reject anything that was a number, because they feel it's not artistic enough, and it doesn't sort of reflect the sort of more ambiguous relationship that they're trying to create with their audiences. I think there might be I need to think about it a little bit more. There might be something in that. There's certainly a temporality quality to
Also
it.
with the question by Andrea about genre, because there are some television genres who actually make coverage and other ones who make permanence.
Yeah.
And these are quite opposite things
Yeah.
that you can get with a show. So maybe also the coverage is a more external way, a more around the content way of watching even the content, while the permanence, I don't know.
Yeah, I will. I've made notes. I will mull it over.
Well, I'll get in with a question. Oh no, you go.
Yeah, I wanted to bring all this to the notion of form. So would you say, given that for people this sort of all of these sort of captivating activities are so important, but also given that practitioners or media makers are actually asked to create these kinds of behaviors, right? Do you think we need to think of form as something that encompasses all of these activities that actually media makers plan for?
What do you mean by form? Because
Yeah.
I use form in a specific. So within the model, form of engagement has a particular kind of connotation to it. So do you mean media?
I guess the
form?
aesthetic form, yeah.
Aesthetic form. Yeah, I mean they did talk about sort of what made good content, and it was this isn't necessarily aesthetic form, but it was the kind of classics of it's well made, it's well acted, it's well written, all of those kinds of things. Again, never really defining what any of that meant. But I guess in terms of form, the most interesting thing was the parallels they drew between different forms. That sometimes they would explicitly, this is audiences, some practitioners were far more, a game's over here, a web series is over here, a comic book's over here, partly because it's their job to navigate that, and so they position themselves within the industry as being the people who can do all of them and bring them all together. But audiences would either explicitly say, oh, reading a book is like watching a video game, or they would just slip. They would be talking about a video game 1 second, and then they'd be talking about a long-form TV the next. So they really slipped between the sort of the rigid media form boundaries that we often put around content. They would just, it was all the same to them in a way. They'd just slip between them quite happily and not see a problem with it. So I have a big kind of anti-medium specificity thing going on.
So I'll get in with a question. Well, actually, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but anyway, my main interest of study is video games. So and the term immersion is very common in video game fans and in video game discourse and everyday culture and talk.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, because a lot of the participants were talking about video games and how they were immersed, and now I would sit doing nothing but playing Uncharted and things like that. So they never mentioned the term immersion. You didn't see it come up once in a while, or not specifically?
Not that I can remember.
Right.
It was more me reading immersion into the kind of things they were talking about. It could be because I wasn't pressing them specifically on video games. I was kind of not trying to prioritize any medium to get this sort of sense that it sits across them, or to explore this idea of whether it does. But yeah, they didn't. I mean, they did talk about the sort of more perspective immersion, so differences between first person versus, omniscient God, third person games and God games and stuff. So the kind of tools that video games have that do a kind of more physical immersion, or sensory immersion, I guess, perspective immersion, that did come up. That then got wrapped up in the kind of gender politics of video games and the idea that they didn't like, if female gamers really didn't like first-person shooters because of the culture around them and stuff. So it got messy. Practitioners, interestingly, a lot are talking about VR like really heavily. I got a lot of kind of, yeah, it's the next greatest thing in my
It
interviews.
is, right?
And that obviously is a very different, it's deliberately playing with that notion of immersion and a kind of physical notion of immersion. And again, when I know I was deliberately oversimplifying really difficult terms. In the book, I will explore different forms of immersion, that there are kind of different ways that immersion can be understood that are applicable in this. I just didn't have time to do that, unfortunately. But the term itself, yeah, they didn't really bring it up, bizarrely.
Yeah, and I was surprised by well, no, it's not that I was surprised, but I was wondering if in a qualitative analysis of how they talk about their immersion and what it means for them to be, well, engaged or immersed. The question of challenge, does it ever comes up, or maybe that's not something you were
that did.
it did.
Some of them did talk about there are a lot again in the video game conversations, which is why, although I'm a bit anti-medium specificity, you do also kind of have to recognise that there are unique properties to each form as well. A lot was sort of talking about the grind of leveling up in video games, that you've got to do all of this stuff to get your character up to the level where you can do the interesting bit, and that was really disengaging and really boring. So yeah, a few did talk about games specifically as a kind of challenge, and that then finding the solution to that challenge was part of what engaged them. In a way, that sort of falls under the form bit. Because that was the kind of intellectual form of intellectual engagement, that there's a kind of puzzle which in a way is akin to a really complicated TV narrative.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was.
Yeah. So that's sort of, I'm trying to break, and again they all overlap and it's all a big mess and it doesn't really make sense in my head yet, but it will. But yeah, that sort of more I think falls under the form of response that we have to an engaging piece of content, that sometimes it's basically our head, sometimes it's our heart, sometimes it's our body, and sometimes it's all three. So yeah, I think that sort of fits more in the kind of form bit of my particular model.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions for our presenter? Just une petite seconde.
You talk about immersion and engagement, and like there's synonyms.
Part of my point is they're not actually synonyms. In some contexts, for audiences, yes, they are. For practitioners, they're not. And that's part of what I'm trying to do with the project, is map the various terms that get associated with engagement within particular instances where they get used and by particular stakeholders. And yeah, part of the point is that for some, yes, they are. They're completely synonyms, but for the industry, they're not. And actually, they prioritise quite unimmersive behaviours. Like a tweet isn't that immersive, but that would be labelled by the industry as engagement. So it's precisely about trying to complicate where synonyms might be assumed, or what those associations are and how they get made and by whom and why.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you.